Hello, welcome to Phase 1, Business Mentorship International's business vehicle process. And we're so excited to get ready and get started on these teachings. And we've kind of decided to start from a different place than most Christian business teachings start, because there's some misnomers out there in the body of Christ that Jesus was poor, that Jesus was a homeless person, basically, that barely could pay attention, and that he really only by the Spirit could lead people, that he had no assets, he had nothing in his life. And so what we're going to try to do is insert some doubt into that belief and to explain where it came from in the first place. So let's get started with the teaching right away. And it's going to be a little different, a little closer up, a little bit more face-to-face, because we expect you to go ahead and look some of this stuff up. I don't want you to believe what we're saying just because we're saying it. I want you to go out there and research it of your own so you can believe in your heart that it's okay for you to have wealth. See, as a Christian, you've been taught your whole life to be more like Christ, to be more Christ-like. And if we're going to be more Christ-like, yet Jesus was poor, then we should be poor. So now we have a fighting going on within our brain. One side saying, well, I'm supposed to be poor because Jesus was poor. On the other side, well, the world says I should create some wealth in my life so that I can make a difference for the kingdom. So you have a back and forth going on, and it says in the word that a double-minded man should expect nothing. So what we have to do here is to clear some things up about Jesus, where he came from, and the fact that either he was broke or the fact that he may have had great wealth. So let's get started. One of the first things to consider was Jesus was born of the lineage of David, the house of David. We know that both Mary and Joseph were born of that lineage. And we know that in Matthew 1 through 17, it talks about that. And in Luke 3, 23 through 37, it also talks about that. So you look those up on your own time, look through that, that's part of your homework, and make sure you understand that they were born of the house of David. And we know that the house of David was not a poor house. We know that the house of David was the house that Solomon was king in, and that King Solomon was the wealthiest man ever on this planet. So we have to assume that maybe there was still a little bit of wealth available in the household because they came from the house of David. But if that's not enough, we'll go on. Mary's family was connected to the priesthood. Elizabeth married Zacharias. Now we know that a priest could only marry into a priest's family or one of high social standing. So either Mary's family was of high social standing or Mary's family had great wealth. One or the other. Either way, they were not dregs or vagabonds in the community. They were people of influence. Next, Jesus spent time at prestigious banquets, and he would frequent many social events. As we know, his first miracle was a miracle of excess. His miracle was when his mother told him to go and they needed wine. And he said, my time has not yet come. And they were kind of embarrassed because the wedding ceremony had run out, the wedding party had run out of wine, and that was a big deal because this was a big event. How do we know it was a big event? Well, we have a wine steward. More than that, he was actually the one who catered the whole event. He set up the whole event. He coordinated the whole event. And it was up to the bride and the groom to provide the wine for that ceremony. So we know now that it was kind of a big deal that this guy, they had enough money to pay for someone to actually run the party. And so it was a very big embarrassment to the family if they had run out of wine. So Jesus had them assemble 6 pots of full water. Now these pots were each 18 gallons, and 6 times 18 is 108 total gallons. And he converted the water into wine, which was kind of a foreshadowing of what he did with us. So he converted the 108 gallons, not for any spiritual reason, except for they needed wine. And then the wine steward said that he had typically that in events like this, that they would save the best, they would utilize the best wine at the beginning of the ceremonies, and then when people are a little bit drunk, they would give them the lesser wine. But in this case, this wine was better than the first wine. So Jesus, his miracle was a miracle of luxury, and it wasn't just good wine, it was more than enough wine, and it was the best wine. That's just how he showed up. And that's how we're supposed to show up. But that might not be enough, so let's keep going. We got to keep convincing. We got to keep creating some doubt here. Well, you know, the inn was full. Joseph just didn't have the money. Well, it doesn't say that. It says the inn was full. In Luke 2:7, it talks about the inn being full. So if the inn was full, that doesn't mean that he didn't have the wherewithal to be in the inn. As a matter of fact, inns at that time were free. And the way that the innkeeper would make money is they would house the animals in the center of the inn, and then they would make money to feed the animals, clothe the animals, and feed the patrons. So that's how money was made. The fact that everyone was traveling for the census meant that many of the inns were full, and Jesus and Mary got there too late. So they actually did the next best thing. They went to one of the caves where they would keep some of the additional animals, and it was shelter and there was food. So we like to say, well, poor, they had nothing. They had to be out into the manger, or the place where the animals were, which was actually a cave, which was actually better sheltered than the inn itself. Let's move on. We know that there were magi. What are magi? Well, magi were these amazing men from the East that we read about, that were astronomers, astrologers, scientists. Some would say they were more magician than they were priests, but they were considered priests in their time. And we know that there were three magi. Or do we know there were three magi? We know that we've been told, based on folklore, myth, and legend, that there are three magi. But the word doesn't say there are three magi. The word says there were three gifts. We know there's gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But we don't know how many kings or magi came from the east. It just says these were the three gifts they brought. We do know that they came in a caravan. They came in a caravan because traveling in a caravan was very important at that time, because there was many robbers on the trade routes at that time. So you travel in great numbers. And so it wasn't just three guys traveling by themselves with, what would they say, a bottle of Chanel No. 5, a roll of nickels or a roll of quarters, and a couple of coins of gold. It was these men traveling with these great caravans, and these caravans would consist of 30, 40, 50 people with camels and horses and all that was required to go a long distance, which was about a 2-year travel to get everything together, to put it together in a caravan and start the travel. So we know that it was about 2 years before the Magi showed up where Jesus was. They didn't show up where he was in this little manger, this place where he was born in this cave, because that would have been an instantaneous transformation. If you'll read the word, you'll find out it took him about 2 years to take this journey, and they followed the star that led him to where Jesus was during this 2-year period. Let's move on. We also know that the Magi went and spoke to King Herod. It states that in Matthew 2, 4 through 6. He asked, where would the child be born? And they told him, in Bethlehem, based on the scriptures and what the prophets had said. So they were stopping by the local king to find out where this child was. And the local king, being Herod, saw all of the goodies they had, and they were not bringing those goodies to King Herod. So they were probably he was probably a bit frustrated. And they were bringing all these gold and frankincense and myrrh to this young kid that was called the King of the Jews. And that's what the word says. He was the King of the Jews. And in the word, it also talks about, in Matthew 2:11, that both Herod and all of Jerusalem were troubled. Well, if Herod and Jerusalem were troubled, that means that it wasn't some sneaky little, quiet little thing that happened in the still of the night. It came in with great fanfare. When 40, 50 people with camels and horses and a caravan of goodies comes into the town, people are noticing. And so When they heard the word, all of Jerusalem was troubled, and Herod was troubled. So that's why Herod called them privately at a later time to his chambers so he could discuss with them that he too wanted to bow down and worship this king. And of course his intent was to kill this young man once he found them. And we know the story later that when Joseph was given the word from the angel to leave and go to Egypt, that Herod had every child 2 years or under killed in the area. So Jesus had escaped to Egypt, and which was an okay thing because they had now a ton of gold, a ton of frankincense, and a ton of myrrh, the things of value at that time. And if they were poor, at that point they were poor no more, because an entire caravan of goodies came their way, and they had more wealth than practically a king would have at that time. Reason with me. Hear what I'm saying. Read the scriptures. Read Matthew 2, 1 through 3. Read Matthew 2, 11. Read Matthew 2, 4 through 6. See what it says, not what we've been told through folklore, myth, and legend. See what the words actually say. We know that Jesus was well educated. How do we know that? Well, in Luke 2, 41 through 50, it talks about that he was a 12-year-old boy sitting in the synagogue teaching, and they were astonished at his knowledge. And we know that he was well educated because the only ones that were educated, we know that he had some wealth because the only ones that were well educated at that time were the children of wealth. They went to school. The others had to work. They had things they had to do. The children of wealth went to school. They learned the Torah. They learned the Talmud. They learned all the things they had to know so that they could be better stewards over what God had given them. And so we know that they spent 3 days looking for him, and they found him teaching in the midst of all these scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees. So we know there that he was a well-educated young man, and with that education, there was an association of wealth. Now, one of the exciting things about finding out was Jesus poor, wasn't Jesus poor, was that the disciples themselves appeared to be businessmen. They were, for example, we know that Peter and Andrew were fishermen. We know that James and John were fishermen. We know that Matthew was a tax collector. We know that Luke was a doctor. So we know that Jesus didn't go to the unemployment lines looking for those that needed work. He actually went to the people that were already doing something. He knew that they would do something. They had the right mindset to do something, and right now they were employed doing different trades. So in Matthew 4:18, it says, "And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he saith unto them, Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And because he looked like a vagabond, and he looked like a bagless guy, they, of course, immediately went straight away and left their nets and followed him." Well, of course he didn't look like that. He didn't look like a homeless man. He didn't look like he had no wealth. He must have looked like a very impressive man, and he must have looked like he was very well off, because they were willing to leave their business fishing and go follow him to be fishers of men. He must have been a man of influence. So we know that just in today's society, the rich follow the rich, the poor follow the rich, but the rich do not follow the poor. Let's not try to make this so spiritual that it makes no sense. He must have looked like a man of wealth. He must have looked like a man of influence, that they would actually just leave and follow him. But maybe that's not enough. So we'll talk just a little bit more about some other opportunities that might help us in understanding that Jesus may not have been poor. In Mark 6:37, talks about his ability to feed the masses. That he had the ability, in Matthew 6:37, to feed the 5,000 men. And then there were women and children there, which would have been 10,000. And they said, should we go and spend that money? Let's go to the exact scripture. So in Matthew 6:37 it states, he answered unto them, give ye them to eat, because he knew that they were hungry, right? And they said unto him, shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth or dinar of bread and give them to eat? See, it wasn't the fact that they couldn't, it was, do you want us to do that? They obviously had the money, or that wouldn't have been the question. The question would have been, Jesus, we don't have the money to do that. But he saith unto them, how many loaves have ye? Go and see. So he was going to glorify God and show the power of God, that money was not the provider for these people, that the Lord in his grace was the provider for these people. But the fact was, he had the money to go ahead and buy the loaves necessary to feed 10,000 people. Or maybe not, just for your consideration, looking at it a different way. And when it was done, there was 12 baskets left over, from the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. Just to take it a bit further, just to help you a little bit further about Jesus being poor, Judas carried the money. Why do you need a treasurer if you're broke? All you need is like one pocket. Why do you need to have some guy carrying the money around? In John 13:29, it talks about Judas being the money carrier, or the treasurer for the Jesus Evangelism Society. Women gave Jesus their property and their wealth. It talks about that in Luke 8:1 and 8:3. He said he had at least 82. We know that he had at least 82 disciples. He had his 12 disciples and then the 70. And that's not to mention the others that he had that were, they mentioned in Luke 23:49, and others. So he had over 100 people following him that he had to feed, he had to clothe, and you can't do this for free. They're not going to just do it because his name was Jesus, which they, in those days, the Romans had no value for. They just knew some guy that was some kind of a magician. Speaking on that, the magician portion of this. I just got back from Israel, and I wanted to talk a little bit about why did they think he was a magician. You see, when the Magi came, they believed, the Jewish people believed, that they instilled on Jesus the ability to do great magical things, because the Magi of that time were also considered like magicians, magic. They were considered to be able to do things that made no sense because they were astronomers. They could read what the stars said. So the way the Jewish people of that time qualified the fact that he was doing these great miracles was that he was a magician, that he was a magician of Satan, that he had gotten his power from these magi that came to visit him when he was 2 years old. So that's where the imbalance comes from, and that's where their belief system comes from. And that's why he was being accused by the Pharisees and Sadducees of having a devil in him. Of course, he said a house that's divided amongst itself must fall. So he refuted their claim, but that's where it was coming from. Anyway, moving on. Jesus poured a year's wages on the floor when the alabaster flask was poured on him for when he was going to be crucified. If you'll remember that in Matthew 26:7. And we know that value of that alabaster flask is probably in today's money worth about $60,000 US. $60,000, and he had no problem with pouring that all over himself so that he could be anointed for what he was about ready to do. So, where did this mindset come from that Jesus was poor? Where did this idea that he must have been poor come from? And we know that in 270 AD, a man named Antony, who was a great influencer of people and a very religious and spiritual man, committed a vow of poverty. He was going to die to all worldly things. And really, by dying to all worldly things, he became no influence on the world. And we're supposed to be influencers of the world. We're supposed to be the salt and the light. And it says in Proverbs 18:1 that a man who isolates himself seeks his own desires. He rages against all wise judgment. So right there, the word contradicts the idea that you're supposed to isolate yourself and isolate yourself from the world. See, the key is not, can I find that peaceful place? It's, can I find that peaceful place and be an influencer of the world and guiding them in the right direction toward Jesus? Can I be the salt and the light? Can I make a difference? And then see, the Greeks picked this up even further because they believed that anything made of physical matter was flawed. So now you had the Greek influence, you had Antony's influence with all these religious men that followed him and lived in these caves and had no worldly, and all that ended up happening was we started to have these men hiring prostitutes to come up and see them, and they were doing terrible things to young boys, and it just led to all these bad things because it wasn't right. It wasn't what God wanted. And it all due to the fact that they had to prove that Jesus was poor, that matter was flawed, that we had no value for this earth. So, but Nick, it says here, right here in 2 Corinthians 8:9, that for ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. When was he poor? He was poor for 3 hours on Calvary. He was poor when he became hate so that we would know love. When he became sorrow so we'd know joy. When he became sin so that we would have righteousness. He became poor so we could become rich. So it tells us right there our mandate. His poverty so that we might be rich. So that's our duty, to become rich, spiritually rich, physically rich, so that we can be an influencer on this planet, that we can guide this world, because it's tried to do the best it can right now, and it's going in the wrong direction. It has no more answers. It's trying to answer the answers that it hasn't got right in the first place, and there's still bad answers. So we have to take back what's rightfully ours. And we use the vehicle of business to take back what's rightfully ours. So I ask you to free your mindset of this stinking thinking, as we used to call it, that Jesus was poor, that he was broke. One final note, why would you gamble for a poor man's underwear? Right after he'd been crucified and beaten, if you really didn't care who he was anyway, if it wasn't one of the finest pieces of cloth, seamless, they say, and they gambled for it, they drew lots for it. Now, I was there in Israel, and I was there at the site, and there was an actual circle that they had around the cross, the crucifix, where they would crucify people, and this circle is where they would actually do the game of lots. And the people that had any valuables left, the guards themselves would draw lots to see who would get to keep these valuables. And there'd be a series of sticks that they'd put in place, and they'd drop in the center of this circle. And the guards would get around the circle, and then they'd open up the hands, and the lots would fall. And whichever way the most lots fell, that individual would get the whatever the individual had that was on that cross that had value would become the possession of that guard. So that's where the lots came from. And obviously they thought his underwear must have been fairly expensive. Why would a poor man have expensive underwear and seamless underwear? It makes no sense. So, again, I hope I've created some doubt in your mind that Jesus was not poor, that it's nothing holy, nothing spiritual in being poor, that it's easy to vow poverty. It's easy to quit. It's easy to have nothing. The tough part is seeing that you are called to do something and pursuing it with all your passion, all your soul, all your might, all your heart, knowing that you were created for that thing, knowing that God put his fingerprints on you, your talents, your gifts, so that you could achieve that thing. And when you're at the top of the hill, when you're at the pinnacle, when everyone says, how come you? Why such great things in you? You can do what you were called to do, which is all glory and honor goes to God through Jesus Christ. See, that's humbleness. Humbleness is not thinking you're a worm in the dirt. Humbleness is giving glory to where glory is due. Our job is to get out of the way and do the best job we can possibly do. Well, thank you. Do your homework. Ask us questions if you don't agree with something or if you need some guidance. And let's go on to step 2, our next training lesson. Thank you.